to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, is the government too incompetent to pull off conspiracies? Tim.
Well, we have our official title, but we can also call this "Can 100 People Keep a Secret?" Because a conspiracy is a group of people conspiring to commit an action, which in the human action standpoint is beneficial to them. One of the unintended consequences, what got me into this topic, unintended consequences of YouTube censorship, is I started watching a Rumble, and on Rumble, I got there because of Glenn Greenwald, and on Rumble there was this show which was recommended, which was called Conspiracy Pill, and they were quite good, and they went through a number of them: 9/11, the moon landing, Pizzagate, I think even the Oswald Royal, the act alone in the Kennedy assassination. I'm not here to talk about any individual conspiracy theory, rather them as a general set. And one of the things I noticed is all the official, to go back to the human action standpoint, all the official explanations are quite milquetoast or flaccid or just kind of lame here, and there are a lot of holes in them, so to speak. And that's just the official explanations. I never really looked into, for example, the 9/11 one recently, but there are there's not much videos of the Pentagon being hit. That's just weird. You can call me a tinfoil hat lunatic if you want, but the fact that there's only one grainy security footage video of it, and the other ones happen to just disappear, that's kind of weird, to say the least. So here, and I think we libertarians have a special insight here, and also a sort of a disinsight, if that's a word. And one of the debates that happens in libertarians is the state evil, or is just an incompetent, bumbling fool? And for the most part, one of the things that anytime you see a conspiracy, one of the things that get stated is, the state's too incompetent to do that. The state, and you hear high-profile libertarians, more like the Reason magazine set here, but this sort of comes from Hayek. This is one of the Hayek versus Mises, I argue, splits here, where the Mises think that humans are rational, and the state, and this is my simple line of argumentation here, individuals make plans, people make plans, large organizations make plans. If you take the Kinsella, you take the Chomsky, you take the Carsonite analysis of the state is just a giant corporation which has no competitors. So since individuals make plans, the people make plans, large organizations make plans, the state is just a large organization. So why can't the state conspire to do things that are in its benefit? There's a means, the motives. You need the means, motives, and ability. The state has all three of them here. If you notice recently, speaking of large organizations, Volkswagen more or less defrauded emission standards. And it wasn't just a minor thing. You need a few hundred people probably to pull that off. And for 6 years, it basically happened. By definition, if organizations are too incompetent to do things, this couldn't happen. Because corporations and states bear a lot of sort of organizational similarities. Actually, so in that sense, if no one can keep a secret, there's enough born-again climate change believers that would benefit from blowing this up. Now, again, I'm glad Volkswagen didn't, so to speak, defraud the emission standards. Good for them. That's a good argument for Volkswagen buying a Volkswagen car. But to go back to the state, make a similarity between the state and large corporations, everyone agrees that corporations have committed, quote unquote, some form of conspiracy here. I mean, that's why regulators. That's the normie argument for regulation to begin with here. So, and I don't think there's that much difference between a state and a large corporation. Just the state has more tools available than a so to speak private, air quote, mega corporation. In that it has the court systems. It has, Hans Hoppe was recently on a TV show. You're a federal judge. Of course, you're gonna. He was making fun of a German judge who worked for and I was like, the state has lots of actors which are going to arguably rule in the favor. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be conspiratorial that they rule in the favor. They just either the rules are written in favor of them, or the rules are and the people, the rule followers and the rule enforcers will give them the benefit of the doubt. And speaking of things keeping a secret, during World War II, it turns out Truman, MacArthur, and Nimitz did not know there was an atomic bomb. I mean, again, those are huge people in the American high command at that time doing actual things. And now, again, speaking of conspiracy theories, to say that they were just like minor puppets, that would be a conspiracy. So, like, huge number of people did not know about the Manhattan Project. Again, by definition, that could not happen. The normie line is, "Oh, I work for a large organization. How could that could happen?" The secrets would get out. The only two people can't keep a secret, only if one of them dead, which is not empirically true. There are conspiracies that happen. The difference between small conspiracies, like let's say Volkswagen, and large conspiracies is A, the state's doing it, and B, the state has more means to enforce dissidents, and C, the population. This is where I think that gets more interesting. It's sort of like the big lie. There's too many people that would lose their jobs if this comes out too quickly, or there should be too much like disaffection, right, would be the word, toward the state. If 9/11 or the moon landing was indeed a psyop. So there's a huge amount of people. You don't even need to cover it up, and arguably, you don't even arguably cover it up. But with it, I sort of laid out a case. For any of these things, you probably need a few hundred people at most. Okay, by filtering effects, okay, the people that are going to be doing this, and then the second hand and third hand people, the government officials, the media watch people, they don't really have an incentive to look into these things, and that's just by filtering effects. You don't even need to blackmail people. You don't even need to threaten people. That's just by filtering effects, and just by career advancement. If Fauci is the funding czar for huge numbers of things, are you going to be that publicly critical of Fauci? Not really. If you work for Boeing or McDonnell Douglas, are you going to be that critical of certain things if you're getting huge? Are you going to be getting huge subsidies from? Most people, not so much. I mean, normie historians, and again, I know we have dissident audience here, so bear with me for just in the thought example. Normie historians will say, "Oh, the Germans, they basically lied to their populations about the Holocaust and all these other things," which by definition couldn't happen by the line they're using, the normies. And actually, the loose change people open up with that. So I do think there's a cognitive dissonance or contradiction that occurs. I do think the state is competent enough when it wants to be, when it has a means to do it. There are things that it can't do. Like, I don't think it actually can physically take over Afghanistan unless it wanted to go full nuclear, or it can take over Vietnam, because that requires a sort of conscript army. There are things I think the state is incompetent to do. I don't think the state can defeat supply and demand totally. But in certain areas, it might be able to do a runaround. So that's my sort of outline. I think there's enough means, enough motive, enough ability. So then what do you make of my case case in favor, not anyone in particularly, but in general? Swithin, can 100 people keep a secret?
Well, clearly, yes. It depends who the people are, and as you said, if you, with the filtering effects of the type of person who gets there, I mean, perfectly plausible that they could do. I mean, you mentioned like Fauci and the stuff with that. I mean, if these people, because some of these people might actually believe in what they're doing, and what they're doing is right and has some good outcome. That why would we sort of say it was a conspiracy? Because we know that people won't understand what we're doing, don't know what the real thing on the inside is, because maybe they can't tell people what's really going on, because it'd be too dangerous for most people to know, because foreign powers or other organizations would be there, and so you can't let them know. So I mean, it's perfectly possible 100 to keep secret, and then of course you go down the whole blackmail route and stuff, and of course there's all that you can do, and that of course keep people quiet. Now, obviously, the more people there are, the more weak links there are in the chain, but the number of people in a sense doesn't matter. It's the type of person. As long as you make sure that even with a sufficiently large number of people, the right people are there, well then yeah, I mean, you can at least you can at least keep it quiet without too much difficulty. With the government being competent, I mean, you mentioned the Manhattan Project. Clearly, the American government was perfectly competent in producing nuclear weapons, assuming nuclear weapons actually exist. on conspiracies, there is a theory that actually nuclear weapons don't exist, or at least they didn't exist when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. But leaving that aside, I mean, they were clearly perfectly competent in doing that. Also, I mean, note things that governments have done. I know libertarians are good at saying, "Oh, the government is useless." It's like, well, actually, it does pull off some good stuff. I mean, let's take this. The Egyptians were pretty competent in building the pyramids. Pretty decent architectural achievement there. The government was, well, the French and British governments were involved in producing Concorde, which still is the fastest commercial airliner ever built, even though it's now retired. Now, where it failed was that it was commercially unsuccessful. It didn't make any money, but on a purely technical level, it worked perfectly fine, and it achieved the goal. I mean, go in some other areas. I mean, certain things the BBC have produced historically with TV serials and stuff. I Claudius would be a good example. High level drama series, well written, directed, acted, etc. Was produced by basically an arm of the state. Now, I know you could say, well, it's not really part of the government. But then again, we're going to get into disputes as to what's the government and what's not the government here. But it is perfectly true. I mean, it's obvious that they can produce good things. I mean, the government produces, at least when they're built originally, good roads. I mean, they are smooth. So the problem with the government is not that it can't do anything good. It's just that either the opportunity cost is really high, and that the way they fund the things they do are things that people don't want, and the way they achieve them is by taking money from them without their consent. That is what the government is, and that's why it's a problem. So when you're saying the government is incompetent, people say incompetent. It's incompetent to do what? Well, do things that are good for lots of people. Well, yeah. But if that's not their goal, then so what? So I think the big problem really is what is really the goal? So whilst it is true that certain departments and things are useless in governments, I mean, it doesn't follow from this. There's no organizational ability. There must be some organizational ability, otherwise the government wouldn't exist. So onto like who in the government could pull off like the conspiracies you mentioned, 9/11. Not to go in detail. I mean, who sort of prime targets and who is sort of reasonably competent? It's probably people within the intelligence services, who would, for the sort of, how should we say, the blackest of the of the conspiracies. Again, because they've got an internal justification for themselves. They may be doing it for the good of the realm somehow. Maybe that actually this thing is needed to wake up America to do something else, or they could purely just be entirely self-interested, and which again is perfectly plausible, just depending on what their funding stream is, or whatever. As I say, you just need to make sure that I mean, as you pointed out, well, as I looked up to it with Manhattan Project, I mean, you just get people to know certain things, and you just limit the number of people who know everything to a very small number. I mean, supposing that, for instance, so I think the Manhattan Project had thousands of different contractors working on it. Oh no, sorry, no, that was. Oh no, sorry, I think of the moon landing one. But either way, even if the moon did what it said it did, the fact is that not everybody would know everything, and if you had always different people doing it in different places, I mean, very few people need to know what the whole operation is anyway. So I see that as a perfectly capable, well, in principle, way of pulling it off. So I mean, I suppose it depends on what the conspiracy is, I would say, as to whether or not anybody could pull it off. For one thing, I think that might be a first one. Is would any group be able to pull it off? Because everyone recognized, say, 9/11 was a conspiracy. The question is, the conspiracy of who? Was it a bunch of Middle Eastern hijackers who somehow got all the planes at the same on the right day at the right time to go and fly into buildings, just so happened when NORAD was down, amongst other things? All these things just kind of came together, which of course is possible. I mean, with coincidences, this is possible. I mean, when a plane crashes, if you watch the air crash investigation, when a commercial liner actually goes down and crashes, it's because basically everything went wrong at the same time, which is highly unlikely. Like all the extra safety systems, like all of them happen to fail at the same time. So I mean, it's possible that that's the conspiracy that was pulled off was, just how happened to be all these things went down at the same time. So I think you need to look at the scope of the conspiracy, what the specific conspiracy would be, what you would need to do to be able to pull it off. And then ask your question, could any group pull it off? And then, if in principle, yes, then you've got to look at the specific, see whether or not the alleged perpetrators are the ones who did it, or could another group have done it. I think that would be the way I would go about looking at it.
One of the things is two questions here. I'll give my answer here. Where's the evidence and who's they? This is a common accusation when you'd say, well, they did X. So and where's the evidence? Well, one of the troubles with evidence itself is evidence is hard. In some cases, it's hard to find, especially if the people doing the thing were covered up. So again, now we're implying they, and then the anti-conspiracy theory. Well, you're expanding the thing. Now you're going to need more people to do things. So one piece of evidence, and it depends on what you count as evidence here. Like the fact that there's only one security video. I might have said this before of the Pentagon hit, and it's fairly grainy. Considering this is even in 2001, this is probably one of the most surveilled buildings on Earth, and there's only one grainy security footage. Like seriously, that's all you have. Like, in a sense, who has evidence here? I mean, an extraordinary claim you're making requires extraordinary evidence, and even so, that was something that sort of blew me away. Like these tinfoil hat truthers had a point. I mean, at least the Pentagon strike has a huge hole, lots of problems in it. So that blew me away. So that's there's quote unquote evidence here, and everyone, for example, speaking of evidence, admits that like Donald Rumsfeld, we did an episode on his known speech. I did the philosophical side of it, but there's no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. They were never found. Arguably, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. So like when you go looking for evidence of a negative or something like that, or evidence of a plot here, which people want to cover up or hide, it's problematic to say the least here. And then to go into the they here, one of the troubles that I would say like the normies have is, and this goes into the Stockholm syndrome point here, is that the state, Walter Block and David Freeman, I think it was David Freeman, Murray Rothbard had this sort of fight maybe 50 years ago here, where like, the state is not just this guy it's not just a common crook. It's a big crook. Now, whether it's like to go like a Satanist cabal or something like that, I don't know. But you can't rule that out. So when the people ask the who's they here, the normies are unwilling to, so to speak, go full in on the thought experiment here. And I think one of the reasons to do that is they don't have an incentive to do that. And B, if they did, they would become a lunatic like us here, and they would suddenly become less agreeable. And this is what filtration point, which I made about a few minutes ago here, that the people doing the conspiracies are already filtered out. Like the people like us would already get filtered out of large organizations. They don't follow the rules to the letter. We make fun of them, and so forth here. And so I think the who's they, of course, that becomes the real question, which is hard to look into. For the Kennedy one here, speaking of, you don't even need to hide the evidence here. For the Kennedy one, it wasn't for two people to have cameras, which were quite expensive at the time. Would there be any evidence that there was a conspiracy in Dallas in 1963? Like, if there was nobody filming it, would there be any evidence? Not really. I mean, it would be hard to do. And as Peter Hitchens reports here, there was a Syrian gas attack, which was probably conducted by the White Helmets, which is like a prop organization, like a false flag. Is this common knowledge? For people like us, it is, but for everyone else, we almost invaded Syria over this. So, like, there's conspiracies that happened in the past. Now, who's they? That again, I'm going to keep repeating that question here because it gets asked to me, and I'm not sure. I can't come to a full answer. The religious people would say it's like Satanists here. And we usually did an episode with Rick Story here on this. So maybe it is. Who knows? I don't have an easy answer here, but I don't think you can rule it out that there is some kind of elites out there that have some kind of control, whether through blackmail of certain things, And this is where there's two other recent things that come in: the Jeffrey Epstein thing, of course, as well as the allegations of a memory implant. All you need is a few key technologies, and a lot of these things start becoming at least plausible. Maybe not doable with a capital D, but at least plausible. So I do think the mainstream sort of just a priori rules it out, and I think they rule it out for a variety of reasons. So with Swithin, what do you make of my they, and where's the evidence here? It's if they are as bad as the conspiracies make them out to be, they're going to be pretty competent, and they're going to be pretty evil, and they're going to be pretty self-interested, and they're going to cover their tracks here. Or in some cases, they don't even need to cover their tracks because people just buy laughable explanations as just there's just only one security footage of this whole thing. So when it comes to that, the evidence and I don't entirely know. So I keep repeating that, but I think it bears repeating because who is it? Swithin, what would you make of it? Do you think the normies a priori rule out the idea of a certain brand of elites? I mean, if you take even Chomsky-like theories of government seriously, the government is not some grassroots democracy. It has its elites, and it has by definition have to have a certain sector of elites, which are unaccountable and self-interested and basically entirely unopposed, other than other elites to come and take them out. So the number of people again to control on this is not very large. I'm gonna keep repeating here. I don't think the person, your uncle who works for the post office, or not saying your uncle, but I don't think your sister who's a nurse, not that you're a sister, I don't think they're in on it. But I do think there are people that look the other way, and then there are people who do benefit from these things happening. So that would be my take on it. I don't think is it the most sophisticated take? Probably not. But I think we can't rule it out. So within, what would you make of those 2 points I made?
I think one thing to note with the normies is that they don't actually rule out conspiracies. If most normies had said, "Oh no, the Chinese government was engaged in a conspiracy," or the Russian government was engaged in a conspiracy, they would go, "Yeah, of course they would," because they're evil dictators there. What I think that a lot of the impetus around, why conspiracies can't happen is because we have liberal democracies, and liberal democracies are open and transparent. And so we would really know about these things. But no, we wouldn't know about it if we were in sort of China or Russia. So I think sort of in a discussion here, it might be interesting to say, do you think, this is what I'm saying, in principle, could something like this happen? And then if so, who might be able to pull it off? Do you think that Xi Jinping could do this? Or could Big Bad Vlad, could he do it? And then if so, then we're just asking who did it, as opposed to whether it was a conspiracy or whether it was just coincidence. Or anything like that. So I think that's a something to highlight. When it's when it comes to, I think one of the problems is people think that, one of the, I think the most, say they take 9/11, some people say, George Bush got it done. And it's like, well, no, I don't think so. And I think a lot of this comes down to, as well, is people who think the democratically elected, inverted commas, politicians, they think that somehow they run the show and somehow they couldn't do it. To which I probably respond, well, yeah, they probably couldn't. So I think what you really need to have is a more expansive and deeper understanding of what the government is and what the ruling elite actually is. Then you're going to have to do a bit of scrambling around to go, who really are the global elites, who are really the heads of government. So, for instance, Keith Preston would argue Oh, he has, but I may be missing. I don't misrepresent him. He said in the past that like the top wealthiest men in the world list is essentially missing the point. What matters is sort of access to resources, and the Saudi royal family are basically trillionaires with respect to what resources they command as a family. So focused on individuals is really missing the point. And so um, you'd have to figure out who the elites are, and then how this kind of influence things takes place. But just if you did have a small group of people who wanted to achieve something, if they've got sufficient means to do so and they're motivated, I don't see why they couldn't, even if they're affiliated with the government. And as well, when it comes to the government or officials in general, most people don't want to go and say, "Oh, well, it was definitely this black ops by the government that did this," because most people seem to have the intrinsic idea that the rulers they have are kind of are doing things in their interests, and if there's something bad that the government's doing, it's not because the government in its entirety is against people; it's just bad actors. And so, as you say, what evidence would you find? I mean, this is the thing. It's like, oh, there either isn't any like really smoking guns, and then they go, and then the normal types would go, oh well, there's no evidence for this. This is conspiracy. It must have been just some Saudi Arabian and Egyptian hijackers, etc. Um, but then, if you then say, oh look, there's this piece of evidence. Why is there only this camera here or some sort of small evidence? It's like, oh well, that's just by the by. It's like, well, if you find the problem is for the people who just have an a priori objection to conspiracy, either there is too strong of evidence which shows that, well, it couldn't have been then, it must have been somebody else, because if they were as clever as you claim, then they wouldn't have done this. And then at the same time, they then say, well, oh, well, there's no evidence. And then, but then they basically admit that if what you say is true, you wouldn't expect to find that much in that way. You'd have to piece it together from smaller elements elsewhere. So again, with a lot of this, I think a lot of it comes down to more of a theoretical dispute beforehand. Otherwise, when you're going to look at evidence and what constitutes evidence, they're just going to default back onto their, well, the government's really on our side. Liberal democracy is good. Therefore, you're going to need mountains and mountains and mountains and mountains of evidence. Otherwise, we're going to take the official narrative as true. I just think that's the way these people are going to think.
On my own account, like, even there are certain things that I don't touch, and like partly is that I don't have any reason to touch them, or I don't have any interest in it. Even these, what can you actually do if you find them out? If you don't, if you find these things out, then what actually can you do? So like one of the troubles with like the pro conspiracy side, and we did an episode on grifting, for example, is there are incentive structures for people to produce this, which aren't the best either. Whether there's a better, perfect incentive structure is a good question here. So I don't know. Some of them are intention seekers, hoaxers, and so forth, but not all of them. And some of these people are just sort of honest, are basically as honest as everyone else, and they just say, no, this is false, and they have an incentive to make a movie or a documentary or write a book against it here, compiling a case against the official account. So I do understand that there are, of course, limitations here, but even there, there seems to be some evidence against official accounts on most of these things, and if you start looking deeper here, it looks plausible. And in my opinion, if one is true, it makes other ones more likely to be true. So if the government was confident enough to kill John F. Kennedy, then the government's confident enough and capable enough and willing enough to do other things. If you do one thing right, you do other things right here. So I think in this sense, the intersectional leftists who say, well, there's also gender oppression, there's also racial and so forth. Well, I think in a similar way, not to say that it's true necessarily, but in a similar way, like if one conspiracy is true, this feeds into other conspiracy theories being true. So I think they are somewhat linked here. And I think more sophisticated political thinkers that border on conspiracy theories, like Chomsky, for all his criticisms, during the time of the Vietnam War, it was a conspiracy to believe, you were considered a kook to believe that, the government was just acting in, that the North Vietnamese guerrillas attacked the American ship here and so forth. So I I think there's the more sophisticated theorists like a Keith Preston, like a Chomsky, like a Hans Hoppe. You know, one argument is what's new. That's another thing. Like, well, there's lots of these things. So that would be my overall take. I think there's a sort of theoretical thing that people can't keep secrets. I think there's organizations that can keep secrets, and they don't have that much incentive to do so, like Volkswagen, you know. And then if you go bigger, like the Manhattan Project, we've seen it done in the past through compartmentalization. I think it's plausible. That's my overall takes within here on it. I just sort of wanted to sort of get through this sort of common objection. So if you have any other comment points, thanks for doing this.
So yeah, I would agree generally with that. I think before any discussion of sort of conspiracy theory takes place with normies or other people is really one of elite theory. Who is society run by an elite? Is it have like a ruling class of a type? And then if so, what is the nature of it? Is democracy possible? Is rule of the people possible? Or are we always going to have this minority ruling on top? The Populist Illusion by Nima Parvini, which is an overview of various elite theorists, would say, well, no, clearly there is this small coterie of people who rule society. And I think once you have that in mind, then conspiracies become more plausible. As I said before, I think the idea that we have a liberal democracy and no, we wouldn't do this against its own people, yada yada, is basically the view that who we think the politicians are ruling are the most powerful people, which really doesn't seem to be true in any real sense. Not to say they can't do anything, but they're sufficient. They're very circumspect. Now, how and why is another question. And then you might want to get into the types of elite and what type of conspiracy is possible, etc. But I think once you sort of eat the elite theory pill, then things become much more realistic with respect to the plausibility of conspiracies. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.